Our Canadian Department of Peace initiative, and that's whom I'm representing here, is a strategy for achieving a mythic goal, but is not in itself the way we can describe the mythology of peace. A peace mythology will be a coherent collection of myths expressing persuasive and memorable ideas about peace and the recognition of the terrible foolishness and wastefulness of war and other harmful actions. We need a peace mythology because we have learned that historically all peoples have developed a traditional spirituality that was meaningful to their lives, and now we have the challenge to develop a spirituality that guides our attitudes and actions in living more peacefully in a globalized world. The power of mythology is partly in the coherence that each of the stories gives to each of the other stories, creating an aesthetic, spiritual, whole world view. The power of myth is partly in the context of our life experiences that makes them not just plausible, but forceful. So the myth is a network of experience, bits of experience, and these things coalesce around particular stories and make them sound far more than merely plausible. The myth makers and myth tellers create by taking pieces of stories from here and there to build a story, a work of art, that people will recognize and feel a relation to. In a real sense, they will get it. It may be an epiphany, or it may be a more gradual awakening where you perceive cumulatively until you get the whole, in a way similar to getting any other work of art. Finding our myths of peace is a fundamental way of orienting us to a hopeful way of life, living well together in a society that we respect and cherish, with non-killing politics, ecologically sustainable and fair-sharing economics, and inclusive spirituality. We know that we can find some of this in our own traditions and aspirations. This is not the most common kind of contemporary myth. Contemporary mythology draws on a long tradition of the triumph of good over evil. Taking the lead from Joseph Campbell's books and TV series, The Power of Myth, Campbell answered Bill Moyer's question of what the American contemporary mythology is by pointing at Star Wars as a popular example of a narrative of the triumph of good over evil. Star Wars and other big epic narratives like The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter have this common underlying myth. Out of the conflict between opposites, good versus evil, comes the resolution where the well-meaning good guy, who is really peace-loving at heart, is mortally threatened by an evil-meaning bad guy's actions, and at the last moment the good guy miraculously marshals his extraordinary power to achieve overwhelming victory. The winner takes it all, and evil disappears from its active part in the world. Think of Hiroshima or Dresden. These myths are very engaging and exciting. They sell well, they get millions of people killed, not only by deliberate and organized brutality, but also by small acts of casual brutality. These are contemporary echoes of very ancient narratives, mythologies of conflict, the power to subdue enemies, and the triumph of good over evil. None of the great triumphs of power over enemies has survived the continuing flow of human history. Might, like everything else, is impermanent. What is our contemporary Canadian mythology? We can take a lead from John Ralston Saul's introduction, The Power of a Story, in his recent book, A Fair Country, Telling Truths About Canada. Saul's position is that we are believing the wrong myths, based as they are in other countries' contractual systems. These social contracts include the French heritage of a class system based on the seigneurie, the English heritage of a class system based on the family compact, and our next-door neighbor American myth of liberal individualism that has produced a class system of its own. These systems have all had their advocates in Canada and are still found in our socioeconomic elite and our formal education system. And yet these contracts do not sit well with the Canadian social contract of minimal impairment of both individual and group rights and freedoms, with such systems as universal one-tier health care, and with our image of ourselves as belonging within an amalgam of minorities. Saul is pointing the way to finding the truth about our Canadian identity and the historical fact of our Métis heritage, biological and cultural. The first 2 centuries of Canada were a partnership blend of native peoples, fur traders, and coureurs de bois. Part of this heritage is an ethos of peace, fairness, and rather than order, and good government. It comes from the Aboriginal heritage of coexistence and welcoming newcomers, sharing with those in need, and a fundamental ethics based on respect. Warriors were, and are, always present, but they were typically used only as a last alternative and were an admission of failure when political negotiation failed. This has developed into our modern egalitarian, non-monolithic, ever-negotiating, consensus-seeking, individual group balanced Canadian culture, although we have problems just now. We will return to Saul's insights shortly. The myths that he provides are a fine example of the materials that we can draw on to create a peace mythology. So, how about a mythology of peace? It is our role to try to create new myths. I believe that it is within our power to do this, and I am convinced that we must. The peace myths are there, at least parts of them are there. It's not going to take a genius to cobble them together. It may take a genius to cobble them together in the way that gifted mythologists like Joseph Campbell or George Lucas or Tolkien or Eckhart Tolle have done. But it's time to get started. First, let's examine our basic terms, peace and violence. Peace is an impossibly big word, claiming, denoting, and connoting a huge range of relations and a huge scope of geography. Most of us, most of the time, do not really know what we are talking about. A good mythology can provide us with the intuitive understanding to choose our words wisely and so create a healthier dialogue. So we need to examine our language to make it more recognizable, acceptable, and persuasive. The term peace is used so often in opposition to war that many of its connotations are both negative, opposition, and vague. We can improve on this situation by giving a positive and clear alternative, built, I would suggest, on the Earth Charter definition of peace as the wholeness created by right relationships with oneself, other persons, other cultures, other life, Earth, and the larger whole of which all are a part. And we would do well to start from a position of facing the reality that peacefulness is eternally in actual or potential tension with kinds of violence causing harm to humans. A realistic perspective must take in this basic fact, and so we must be comprehensive. Violence is also a commonly used word, but like peace, used with little realistic understanding. Violence is not a thing that could be expunged from our lives. Violence of some kinds is integral and necessary to our lives. All animals eat life in order to live. Consider your own diet. Plants and animals are routinely killed so that you can live. Eating is a kind of frequent, habitual, and necessary violence. So violence is not a condition to be denied. It is involved in doing harm to humans, and in this, it presents recurrent problems to be solved. Our mythology must necessarily be inclusive of this violence, or we will work for peace blindly. We can start by naming the kinds of violence that are the source of our oppression, and then build, as Paulo Freire taught us, using his pedagogy of the oppressed. The first task is to clearly recognize and name what we are facing, and then we can establish priorities, for we surely cannot deal with all kinds of violence at once. We can focus on harmful actions or processes. There are plenty of resources to draw on for this. Our most fundamental act is to connect our peace mythologies with our peace witnessing reality, to connect our actions and words. Put in reverse, let our words speak of peace building and harm prevention based on our mythology of peace, fairness, and responsible government. Most of us in Canada and elsewhere can recall the Pearson style of UN peacekeeping blue helmets, currently reduced to a token group. It became and remains a part of Canadian culture, although they wouldn't fill a school bus right now. Now back to John Ralston Saul for a Canadian myth of peace. He engages some unsatisfactory myths in Canadian history. Why were we a dominion and not a kingdom, as Macdonald and Cartier originally proposed? The British Parliament was not too worried about the word kingdom, since Canada at the time had about the same size population as the 13 colonies had at the time of their revolution, and Canada had plenty of land. It was the Americans who were distressed at the thought of a kingdom to their north, and the Americans pressured the British. So there was a diplomatic negotiation, and we were launched as a dominion. We were the first colony of the European empires to go it alone without bloody violence. From its founding, Canada was an example of peace, fairness, and good government. But the myth went astray because the intent of the word dominion was not colonial subservience, as we wrongly assume. It was biblical and referred to having legitimate power over a domain, as shown in the French language version, where it is puissance de Canada. Saul offers another corrective myth. Ottawa was the statesmanlike choice for the site of the capital city, not a compromise between conflicting interests. Kingston was too close to the U.S., Montreal too Catholic and monolingual French, Toronto too Protestant and monolingual English. Ottawa was safely away from the border, had both languages and religions present, and so it was the most representative of the nation and would best support Canadians' sense of belonging. Again, the Founding Fathers deliberately collaborated to ensure that Canada was an example of peace, fairness, and good government. Following on two of Saul's many correctives to our standard but mythically incorrect history, I want to recommend another mythology of peace, fairness, and good government. Glenn Page has offered a corrective to the prevailing myth of political relations in his book, Non-Killing Global Political Science. The fundamental assumption, articulated by Thomas Hobbes and Max Weber and others, is that nations and individuals must rely primarily on the adroit use of force and the threat of the use of force in order to maintain their autonomy. Their convictions about the nature of social control and political relations were predicated on their flawed conception of basic human nature. Hobbes' famous solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short is echoed in Weber's balancing of the virtue of individual liberty with an inevitable polar night of icy darkness. His essentially tragic view of human nature gave a rationale for his advocacy of mastery over nature through forces of rationalism. This led to the creation of a political science as a science of the exercise of state power. But Page argues that the Hobbesian view of human nature is empirically wrong and morally deplorable, and offers empirical proof. Page cites global statistics on human killing and shows that even in wars, a minority of men become soldiers, a minority of those see combat, and a very small minority of those actually shoot at another human. A radical change of perspective about human nature and the role of state violence is both rational and moral. A non-killing political science is possible, and Page is showing the way. In conclusion, where are we to go from here? What other stories can we draw on for a mythology of peace? How are we then to live? Peace is not utopian, an ideal state to be hoped for. Peace is a global cluster of processes and practices spanning our social geography from inner peace to family to neighborhood to municipality to nation and between nations. The scope of the task is huge. But we have plenty of materials to build with. Think of the related cluster of processes that is developed in what we now term civil society. Hundreds of thousands, conservatively speaking, of small groups that do not add up to an ism ideology with a charismatic hero. Sharing a mythology of human rights and working in the service of environmental and social justice, here is democracy working all over the globe. It is the largest social movement in history. We are a part of this movement, and it embodies notions of harm reduction and peace building that are parts of our peace mythology. It is up to us to reach the media with effective and useful materials, to reach many other NGOs and governments with ideas in a form they can relate to and feel ready to adopt, and to build a popular base of support for the Department of Peace. If there is going to be change in the world, real change, it will have to work its way from the bottom up, from the people themselves. That's Howard Zinn.